I was incarcerated at Manzanar near Death Valley in California from the time I was 7 months old until I was 4. My family lived in Los Angeles, and we were sent away along with my grandfather and grandmother and an aunt and an uncle, my father and mother, and 2 siblings. So we all were put onto a bus with an armed guard and driven the more than 300 miles from Los Angeles to Manzanar. I'm fairly certain that most of you are aware that there was a great deal of anti-Asian sentiment prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. Most people, though, are not aware of the fact that the United States government had, prior to that time, gathered intelligence on the Japanese American community, which included gathering information from the 1940 census. So the U.S. government knew down to a city block where we were, where we lived, what jobs we had, how many people were in the family, even down to the salaries that our mothers and fathers made. Well, it was mainly fathers back then. This first slide is showing some of the kinds of propaganda posters that were up and what we faced, including spray painting of wording like this, also including fake hunting licenses. So there was, as I say, a great deal of anti-Asian sentiment that had followed each of the Asian groups that emigrated to the U.S. or to the Hawaiian Islands. In the early spring of 1942, these posters were attached to the telephone poles, and it said in very explicit wording where we were to gather in order to be taken away. We were limited to only what we could carry, and there were no pets of any kind permitted. If the farmers had crops in the ground, they weren't able to gather those crops before they were sent away. And my grandfather was actually arrested on December 7th, the very day of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that's why I have always questioned whether Pearl Harbor was the sneak attack that they always talk about, because the U.S. government was able to gather up several thousand of the leaders within our community, all up and down the West Coast, and that was because they used the intelligence from the census statistics of 1940, even though we are always told that information is confidential, and it certainly was not, and the U.S. government admitted later that they had used that so-called confidential information. And it actually translates to closer to our time, because after the 9/11 incident happened in New York. The Muslims were also subjected to having their information gathered from the so-called confidential census information. So this is just to describe that what happened to the Japanese population back then is still happening today. My grandfather was sent to a special camp in Missoula, Montana. He was interrogated every day, harshly, and he was not allowed to rejoin us at Manzanar until almost a year later. His best friend was arrested at the same time and committed suicide while in that special camp because he simply lost hope. He didn't think that there was any way that he would ever be allowed to leave, and indeed, many of us thought that we might be killed. We were not told where we were being sent nor how long we would be kept in prison. If you had as little as 1/16 Japanese blood, you were sent away, and that's a condition that's even harsher than that for the Jews by the Nazis. That statistic was 1/8 Jewish blood, and you were taken away. So it was only 1/16 Japanese blood. Orphans were taken out of orphanages, and at Manzanar they were kept in several barracks that was called the Children's Village, and people were taken out of hospitals. Here, this is a blind man being led away. The camps went as far into the interior of the United States, all the way to Arkansas. I'll show you a map that will give you a better picture of how far to the east we were sent. So those who went all the way to Arkansas and past California were sent by train, and this is a drawing that was made by one of the inmates, and it shows a rest stop really in the middle of nowhere, and there are U.S. military guarding them with machine guns. Oh, let's see, I wanted to go backwards here. In the U.S.'s haste to imprison us, we were first sent to what were called assembly centers, and they were usually fairgrounds or, in some cases, racetracks. This is Santa Anita Racetrack, and people actually lived in horse stalls. They were whitewashed, and they put up regular doors. You know how for the horses they have the top half of the door swings out so that the horse can hang his head outside, and at least they changed the doors, but even the whitewashing didn't make up for the smell of the manure that had just been shoveled out of those horse stalls in which we had to live. So this is actually Santa Anita Racetrack, and later on people used to make jokes and say, we were in Manowar's horse stall. So Manowar was one of the race horses that was very famous back then. These are the names of the permanent detention camps or prison camps, and they go all the way from Arizona to actually northern California, Tule Lake, which served at one point as a high security camp for those who didn't sign the loyalty oath the right way. I'll explain that a little bit later. So this shows the camps going all the way to Arkansas. Rower and Jerome were in Arkansas, and both of those prison camps were in a swamp. And all of the places that were chosen were in very desolate areas of the U.S., almost all of them in desert-like conditions. And you can see Colorado with the first name being Grenada. It's a small town in southeastern Colorado, and the locals there pronounce it Grenada, not Grenada. The town had fewer residents than the prison camp, which was originally called a Grenada, quote unquote, relocation center. So a lot of euphemisms were used for the places where we were sent. I think it was the postmaster who, so the mail kept getting mixed up between the town of Grenada and the prison camp Grenada. And so the postmaster chose a separate name for the prison camp, and the name he chose was Amache. And on the there are brochures here if you want to pick them up later. Amache was the name of a woman of Cheyenne extraction, and her father, Chief Onichi, was killed at the Sand Creek massacre in the late 1800s, and and she was married to a cattle baron named John Powers, and the camp itself resides in Powers County. So it's a very long story about how the camp came to be named Amache versus the original name Grenada. This shows, let's see here. For those who were sent by train to the interior of the U.S., that after the trains finally stopped, they would have to go the extra miles by some conveyance to the actual prison camp itself. And so this shows a little girl. She's looking out from behind a truck, and you can see down below where she's holding her hands, it's a tag that, let's see here. I'm going to be, here, I don't want to drop this. This is a mock-up of the tags that we had to wear to identify ourselves. There was a plan to tattoo us in the same fashion that the Nazis tattooed the Jewish people, but luckily that didn't come to pass. So we've just made these up so that people know that that's what happened to us. And 9066 is the executive order that was signed by President Roosevelt that sent us away to the camps. So when we first arrived at the camps, there was nothing inside the barracks that we were assigned to except for a canvas cot on which to sleep, and so there were no mattresses or anything like that. So we were all assigned bags to fill with straw in order to serve as mattresses, and we found out later that those bags were actually body bags. This is a view of Heart Mountain in Wyoming, where it often got to 30 degrees below zero, not what the former residents of California were used to. So I just wanted you to see the row upon row upon row of barracks in which we had to live, and of course the ground would become mud whenever it rained or snowed. This is to show you some of the weather conditions there. At Manzanar, the wind would blow almost constantly, and when we go back on pilgrimages, we usually go back on an annual pilgrimage, and it's one of the sounds of the wind are something that always comes back to me when I go back to Manzanar. And you can see how the trees are bent. That's the force of the wind. And when we go back now, we see very often wind farms because the wind blows so steadily and with such strength that it generates electricity now. Let's see here. It does snow actually in the desert every now and then, and this is just another view of Manzanar after a snowstorm. This is one view of the barracks, and there was no insulation in those barracks. It was just covered with black tar paper, and the striping that you see it's thin pieces of wood that was used to nail the tar paper in place, and we built those staircases up to the doorways. So we would just go and gather wood that was left over from the building of the barracks themselves, and then make rudimentary furniture and so on. If you ever get to Denver, to the History Colorado Center, there's a mock-up of an Amache barrack, and it looks like we had really nice furnishings, but that's because History Colorado's bread and butter is they bring in third graders to view the mock-up of the Amache barrack, and so they have to have a place for the children to sit. So it looks like we had really sturdy furniture, but actually we would just nail together the leftover wood, and sometimes we would use orange crates or apple boxes that used to come in wood. They all come in cardboard now, but back then they came in fresh fruit came in wooden boxes. So we would tip those over and sit and use them for chairs. This is just to show you the fragileness of the barracks in which we lived. You can see that the wind has ripped away the tar paper from the outside. This is the same photo that you'll see on the inside of the brochure. And Amache was probably, in doing research, Amache was probably what we would consider a show camp, a place where if congressmen, and they were all men back then, would come to see how we were living. It was just, the barracks were built more sturdily. You can see that it's not the black tar paper on the outside, so they actually had siding, and they did have just better facilities. The barracks at Manzanar were up on stilts, and so the wood, the green wood would shrink in the desert heat, and the wood, the knots would drop out, and then all of, during the sandstorms, all of the insects and things would come up through the floorboards, including all of the sand from the desert. But at Amache, the beds of the barracks were, they were laid on brick, and so the chances of sand coming through the wood slats were much less. This shows an interior of the barracks before we were able to build our own rudimentary furniture. So there was just a heating element, and someone has gone out on the desert and gotten some kind of succulent from the desert and put it into a can and put it on top of the stove there. And that's why the man is hunkering down, because there's nothing actually to sit on. The drapes in the back are what people use to try and section off some portions of the single rooms in order to have a little bit of privacy for people. This is kind of an odd picture. It's really elongated. It's obviously the beds weren't that long, but it just to show you how crowded it was on the interior. This gentleman has his wash hanging overhead, and then you can see how close the next cot is to his. And I used to always burn myself on the stove just trying to scoot around it because things were packed so tight. We made our own footgear. These are called geta, G-E-T-A. They're the sandals that Japanese wear. And because we had to shower in communal showers, everything was communal. You know, we ate in mess halls and we used latrines. And so this was just to, in getting back from the showers and things, to try and keep our feet from getting sand all over them. We had to wait in line for our meals outside the mess hall, and I can remember my mother always telling me, you know, I had to hold her hand, and she would say in Japanese, "Chanto shinasai," which means, you know, stand up straight and don't talk and behave yourself. And I used to always watch the insects crawling up and down the tar paper just to amuse myself, and, you know, until it was our turn to go in and eat. And once we got inside to eat, it was we had to eat really fast because there were always people waiting outside for their turn to go in and eat. The food was very bad. The goods that were trucked into the prison were all, the good stuff was often skimmed off the top and sold on the black market. So we rarely had fresh food or vegetables and things like that until we started to grow our own. Many of the incarcerees were farmers, and so we irrigated the land. So the water came from the Sierra Nevada mountains at my camp, Manzanar. And so that helped with our diet immensely when we could grow our own vegetables. So that it was, as I say, the good stuff was skimmed off the top, and any vegetables that we had at the beginning of our incarceration it was all canned. And so I'll just tell you a kind of a funny story. Everybody hated the canned spinach because it had a real tinny flavor to it, and but I happened to like the taste of it, so everybody gave me their portion of it. So my nickname in camp was Popeye. So some of you may know that if you lived in Colorado, you didn't, and were Japanese, you didn't have to go into the prison camps. It was only 200 miles inland from the West Coast, so Colorado was out of that Western Defense Zone. So this shows a mother and her two children, and she's brought her children to visit her mother, the children's grandmother, behind barbed wire, because the grandmother was sent to Amache from California, and the mother and her kids happened to live in Denver. So right now it takes about 4 hours to drive to Amache, so I'm sure it took a much longer time back then for them to get all that distance to southeastern Colorado. This is a photograph of the children's village, the orphans who were taken out of orphanages and put into the prison camps. And some of the few survivors still get together today, often at the pilgrimages that we have back at Manzanar. This is Dr. Goto. He's in a makeshift hospital. It's basically a barracks that was made to serve the patients there. The healthcare was very bad. I'm not sure if I have the photograph here of one of the women who died in childbirth because she simply didn't have the help to birth her babies in the prison. My father served as a fireman at Manzanar, and so the first arrow is my father, and the second arrow is actually the barracks in which I lived. And my father chose to be a fireman because he could literally step out of our barracks and into the back door of the fire station, so it was very convenient for him. And the firemen at Manzanar served on the same kind of schedule that most firefighters do today. You know, it's like 3 days on and 3 days off, something like that. So, and I'm sure it was because they could, you know, play poker and things like that as well. And I actually didn't know this until I viewed this photograph with my older brother, who knew that was our barracks off to the side there. This is something called a canteen. So it was like I don't know, maybe like a 5 and 10 cent store, you know, but on a very small scale. And of course, there was no place to purchase clothing or anything like that except through the Sears Roebuck catalog. Of course, all of rural America ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog back then. And there were 4 sewing machines for the 10,000 inmates at Manzanar. So my mother had to sign up for her turn to use the sewing machine, and she could keep it for 48 hours. She would order beforehand cloth and patterns, and she would have everything cut out and pinned and ready to sew when it was her turn to have the sewing machine. And she used to put me in a basket by the side of the sewing machine, and there was no electricity, you know, no plug-in. It was a treadle machine, and I can still remember the sound of the treadle as she sewed through the night, because she tried to stay up the entire time to sew our clothes while she had her turn with the sewing machine. This is Roy Takeno is one of the 3 men here. He was the editor of the camp newspaper, and I always thought they had a sense of humor because they called the paper the Manzanar Free Press. And Roy resettled in Denver afterwards, and he produced a local Japanese newspaper for many years until he retired. This is the loyalty questionnaire that had to be answered by all inmates 17 years of age or older, and there were many questions, but the 2 most problematic were, are you willing to serve in the Armed Forces of the United States? And the other was, will you forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? So if you were, and it created a great deal of controversy in the camp, because if you were like my father, who was born in Japan in Miyagi Prefecture in 1903. He could not even apply for U.S. citizenship until 1952, which would have made him stateless. And of course, he had chosen to come here to the U.S. and so anyway, that was one of those questions. The other, and I'll move it on to the next one, is you'll be hearing about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in just a bit, but very often skimmed over are those that we called the resistors. These were equally young men who were being ordered to, I'm sorry, what is the, I'm sorry, I'm old and I'm having this is where, so our young men were being drafted out from behind barbed wire to go and fight for freedom and democracy. And these young men said, not that they wouldn't fight, but that they wanted their constitutional rights returned to them by being released from prison, their families being released from prison, and then they would go and fight. So this is a photograph of the young men who were put on trial for draft evasion. They were convicted and sentenced to 2 years at hard labor at Leavenworth. And the story that I'm told is that once they got to Leavenworth, the first thing that the resistors did was they put on a judo demonstration, and so that they could assert themselves in their place within the prison hierarchy. I'm not going to spend too much time because I want to be able to you to be able to hear the other presentation. But this is a photograph of some of the goings-on in those special camps, one of which my grandfather was sent to in Missoula, Montana. And just to say that the government's line about how we were treated and is not the truth. This is a prison within a prison at Manzanar. So there was an internal police force. So what the government tried to do was to make it seem as if we were all doing our part for the war, and that we were self-governing, which is really not true. The newspaper that I mentioned, the Manzanar Free Press, was censored, and so this metal cage served as an internal prison within a prison. This is Ruby Watanabe, the mother who died in childbirth. Her twin girls died as well, and their two small caskets are in front of hers. And it looks like those are floral wreaths, but there are no flowers out on the desert except for very small periods of time. So all of those floral wreaths were made out of crepe paper. So there are paper flowers there. This is the memorial that was put up by the internees to honor those who died in the camp, and also while they were away fighting the war. And those are the Sierra Nevada mountains in the background. And this is one of my strongest memories, the barracks that I showed you near the fire station. The barracks was very close to the perimeter of the camp, and so I used to go out and play in the sand near the barbed wire fence, and I would always look up at the top, and there was always a soldier standing guard duty holding a rifle with a fixed bayonet, and you can see that there's a floodlight that played over the camp at night. And I don't think that any child should have to remember being in a place and having a gun ready to shoot with a fixed bayonet at the end. You may have heard of what I consider the so-called reparations back in the 1980s for Japanese Americans, at least those of us who are still alive in the late 1980s into the 90s, when what I consider a paltry sum was finally came through, along with a presidential apology. When you see what happens still today, whenever things like 9/11 happen, with what the Muslims had to go through, the separation of children by certain administrations in the U.S. For those seeking asylum here in the U.S. That there were Latin American Japanese who were also removed from their homes and sent away to prison, often for a longer length of time than the Japanese Americans. Canadian Japanese who are also sent away and lost all of their property in the same way that we did. The Aleuts along the Aleutian chain actually came to the same fate. And I'll end with this, where asking, can it happen again? And my belief is that it definitely could happen again, depending on what administration is in power at the time when something happens similar to Pearl Harbor. So I'm happy to take any questions, and we'll keep it short so that we can get to your part. Yes?
Once your family left the camp, where did you go?
We were given $5 and $25 and a bus ticket to start our lives over again. And even though we had lived in Los Angeles for quite some time before Pearl Harbor, we had to come inland, and that's how come we ended up in Denver, because of my mother's situation. She was born in San Francisco, so a birthright citizen, but she was sent to Yokohama for her education. And the U.S. government said that because she had the so-called rights of a U.S. citizen, but because she was educated in Japan, she might be loyal to Japan, so we had to move inland away from the coast. So that's how we ended up in Denver. My family happened to have a friend who had started a small factory making soy sauce at 3500 Larimer Street, and it's now so it's the factory I grew up in. It's now a very high-end Chinese restaurant called Hop Alley. Okay, if there are no other questions.
Sure. All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'll get this all taken care of.
Sure.
Okay, so my name's Bill Okubo. Sophia did a great introduction of my parents and my dad. And so my mom was Nobi Okubo, my dad was James Okubo. And they were Nisei, so first born in America, first generation born in America. And so I just want to kind of retell some of the story that's includes, after camp and some of that whole situation. So both of them were interned during World War II. My mom grew up in Southern California, Anaheim, Buena Park. She went to Fullerton High in California. And my dad was born in Bellingham, Washington. Actually born in Anacortes, grew up in Bellingham, Washington. So northern and southern West Coast. I'll start with my mom's story and then segue into my dad's story. So my mom was in high school when they had to leave for camp, and she actually graduated from high school while she was in camp. So her retelling of the stories was always, she was thinking as an American child, born here, friends, at school and what have you. So she retells the story sort of from a child's perspective, and I think over time, maybe some of that, the trauma of that got glossed away, I guess I would say. So, but some of her takeaways, Marge, the photos that you had in addition to your story were really fantastic for me to see that, because it really illustrated some of the things that I've heard orally from my mom and family members. So that scene of, stuffing your own mattress with hay, and that's your bed for the duration, right? And my mom, I believe her family was at Santa Anita as well before they went to, she was at Poston, was the camp that she was at in Arizona. And so, the stories that I heard from her, a couple of things about that. Her parents, her father had already died before the internment. And so at that point, my grandmother was, the single parent, so to speak, but there were lots of kids in the family, and the eldest sons kind of took over to take care of things. So when they had to leave for camp, they kind of handled all that. And really, it was a super traumatic thing for my grandmother, and my mom tells a story how basically she had a nervous breakdown from that, and she never really recovered from that the rest of her life, even after they left camp. She tells a story how when my mom and dad got married, they went to visit her in Southern Cal, and her mother didn't even recognize her at that point because she was just institutionalized, right? So it was a very sad part of the story there. My mom, while she was in camp, I guess people had to work, and you got a small amount of pay for the work that you did, and she was an assistant to a sociologist who was at the camp, sort of doing a study of the populations there and how that really impacted the people that were in the camp. She had a copy of that book, and I'm forgetting the name of the book and the sociologist person who wrote that, but it was something that was, very treasured by her, and it was sort of a well-worn book that she always had when we were kids. So then when she left camp, you had to either have family members located somewhere that could sort of vouch for you and sponsor you, or a sponsor. So I think there were different religious groups and so forth that would sponsor people inland. So she went to Detroit, Michigan. She was a nanny for an English couple. They had a son, and she helped to raise him, while he was, still not college age and so forth. So at that point, she had graduated from high school. This English family was they were very supportive, and I believe they paid for her tuition at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in Detroit. So, I always felt sort of odd as a Japanese American kid growing up in Detroit. The only other Asians I knew were my cousins, and then in high school I knew one kid who was Chinese, and that was about the extent of the Asian population there at that point in time. And but anyhow, she went on to Wayne State University and graduated there. That's actually where my parents met. So that's a pretty good sampling of her side of the family. So I'll kind of switch over to my dad. My dad was mostly raised in Bellingham, Washington. There's a news article here that was written in 1981 by a local resident in Bellingham, Carol Tashima, who is a local historian. And really told the story about the Japanese Americans in Bellingham. It was a small community, a handful of families, and my dad's family and his cousin's family were there together, and they made up maybe, you know, a fifth of the Japanese population there. So families were pretty big then. It's, you know, like 10 plus kids in the family type of thing, sort of, right? So, my dad's family, my dad's family, they were, my dad owned a restaurant called Sunrise Cafe, and so it was just kind of like a little place. There's a citation in here about how it was known as a good place to get a cup of coffee and a donut. Probably not the finest food, right? And it actually still exists today in, it was a few years back, my sister and I went to receive a honorary degree from Western Washington University. I think it was college at that time. But he was in college when he was in Bellingham when he had to leave for camp. And we went and received this honorary award degree for him. And Carol took us around town and showed us places. So I saw my dad's family's home. It's still there and it's been redone, and you know, it's on like Zillow or whatever, and it's a nice looking house, right? And then this little Sunrise Cafe is now just some cheesy looking bar right on the waterfront there. So it's kind of funny it still exists. But so his upbringing was very much, you know, the Northwest. He liked to ski, he liked to fish. He actually worked at least one summer in Alaska at the canneries, and I think some of his brothers and cousins worked there as well. And he would hike up, you know, at that point in time, you'd hike up and then ski down the mountain. There wasn't any lifts really. So he was a skier, and our family, as a result, all skied as we were growing up. I have a brother and sister. We would all ski, and my mom learned how to ski because my dad really loved it. To get out of camp, my dad actually enlisted in the Army, and that's the 442nd Regiment. And it was really, you know, there were two sides of the picture. A lot of people really felt that that was shameful, and so his mother really particularly took a lot of flack from some of the other people who didn't think that was appropriate given how, you know, they were treated, right? And so he really held back on telling anybody they enlisted until the day he had to leave, and then he left. But I still think, you know, people look down on that in some way, shape, and form. So the 442nd Regiment combined with the 100th Battalion. The 100th Battalion was Hawaiians who were enlisted as well. So the 442nd was mainlanders. So there was sort of a culture clash in that Army unit because the Hawaiians spoke sort of this pidgin English, hard to understand, and the mainlanders were, you know, these goofy, you know, mainland American kind of guys. And one of the stories I always heard growing up is, you know, when these guys were in basic training and so forth, they're messing around with each other, and the Hawaiians would wrestle with the Americans, and they'd get into these little tussles, right? Well, this nickname came out of that where the Hawaiians would call the mainlanders katonks, and it was because when they're wrestling, if they knocked their head on the ground, that was the sound their head made when it hit the ground, right? So, you know, just kind of a funny way for the groups to kind of come together. But they really, you know, in the Army, I think this is true in any generation of the Army, there's a bonding that's like unbelievable. And my dad was part of Company K, and after the war, he went back for some reunions in Hawaii with these guys. And then later on in life, I went with my mom to go to at least one of those. And then during this whole Medal of Honor ceremony, there was a ceremony in Honolulu, and a lot of those guys came and really, you know, met with us. And it was really a neat circumstance to hear stories from other guys telling me about my dad. My dad ended up dying in a car crash when I was 7 years old. So I didn't really get to know him when I was a kid. He went on to become Well, so when he was in the Army, he was a medic, and it's kind of unusual that a medic gets gets the Medal of Honor, because you're not really in action, you're just trying to treat people. And it's it's field triage. There's not a whole lot they can do for you. They've got to get you out of there to really treat you and get you to the hospital. So there's this little piece here was a letter written by one of the fellow 442nd soldiers, who talked about how my dad treated him and his sergeant, and it was an incident where his sergeant really got injured badly. This gentleman left the war and never knew what happened to his sergeant, and later on they connected back together. He was still alive, and they got together and got to see each other. And but his retelling of the situation was, you had to be crazy to want to be a medic in the Army, because you're just, people are dying in your arms, and all you're doing is treating people. It's a lot of what we call PTSD now. I guess everybody had pieces of that from that period. My dad did end up, after the war, he had high blood pressure after that was never really treatable at that point in time. And my mom told the story about how she really felt like it was like a physical change in my dad that really impacted him the remainder of his life. Let's see. The upgrade to the Medal of Honor happened at that 2000 ceremony, and it was 22 Asian Americans, almost all Japanese American, that were awarded. And my dad was the last one to get into that. And the telling was that it was because he was a medic. It was a little on the bubble as to whether they would pull him in for that. And this got sponsored by one of the people was Senator Akaka, who kind of pushed that whole thing through. So our entire sort of extended family went to DC for the whole, it was like about a week long of ceremony. I was only able to go for part of it. But we met, we went to the White House for the actual ceremony with Clinton. My mom accepted posthumously on behalf of my dad. And it really, I am not military, my brother's not military, sort of our generation, none of us really served, and it was really an eye-opener for me that the honor that the military really extends to its people is really amazing. So they treated us like VIPs, I would say, and shuttled us to all of the ceremonies, and took care of everything. Like if my mom needed something from the little 7-Eleven, they'd run over there and get it for her, and so it was really an incredible time. And we visited Arlington, and we went to the Pentagon. All of that was part of the ceremonies that we had for that. So let's see, just trying to summarize a little more from that. After the war, I talked about how my mom ended up in Detroit. My dad went on, he wanted to pursue some medical dental, so he ended up going to dental school and then graduating, and he became a professor at University of Detroit, the dental school, and he had his own practice. And he was able to he ended up in Detroit because one of his brothers was there, one or two of them were already there. So since he had a family member, he was able to go there as well. And that was kind of the story that led to the two of them meeting at Wayne State University. The other piece I was going to say about sort of that, connections, thinking about connections here in Colorado, my mom had at least one brother, and several of my uncles on both sides served in the 442nd Regiment. And one of them actually before, I guess that was before, I don't know if it was before camp, but one of them actually spent time in the Fort Morgan Sterling area picking sugar beets, right? And so years later, I saw a picture of my uncle in uniform in front of a statue that I recognized from Denver. And it's inspired this conversation with my cousins about, hey, this looks like he was in Denver, blah, blah, blah. Do you know what that story is? And it was kind of cool to hear that he had been in Colorado. So I ended up here because of the skiing. I grew up like my dad, loving skiing. We skied in Michigan on these little hills and wanted to come where there's some real mountains, right? So I lived a couple years in Steamboat, transferred in to CU and finished my college degree there. So that's how I ended up in the Denver metro area and have been here since then. So that's a little bit of, I guess, the oral story of, my parents' journey. Let's see, I don't know, are there any questions people have? Yes.
Did your father ever talk about his decision, whether he was glad that he made the decision to serve as opposed to being a conscientious objector?
Yeah, because I was so young, I didn't hear these stories directly, but I think he was like my mom in that they felt very American and very loyal and wanted to support the war effort. And I don't think that generation, he had those ties back to Japan the way, the grandparents, his parents and my mom's parents would have. So, I think he always felt good about that, and then it really, obviously changed his life tremendously and set the ball in motion for an entire career from there. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
How long were each of the families actually in camps?
Yeah, I think the period was about 2.5 years. Is that?
We were there almost 4 years.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I'm guessing your father probably served in the Pacific?
No, actually he served in Europe. And I think the majority of the 442nd was in Europe. I actually recently saw something that there were some who served in the Pacific, but all of my uncles and my dad, it was Italy and France was where they were, right? And his citation was from France, yeah.
Do you think that was deliberate to have the Japanese Americans?
It seems like to me that would be the case, right? Yeah. So, and the 442nd Regiment was really, so it continues to be the most awarded regiment in the Army even today. And, they were sent into really sort of hopeless type situations, and somehow those guys prevailed. I think they really were committed to just doing everything they can. So, yeah.
There's actually a backstory to that. So that the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. But the backstory is that they were commanded by a white general who hated their guts. So he sent them into the worst parts of battle that he could, and that's why there were so many casualties, so many deaths, and so many Purple Hearts.
Yeah.
So they were known as a Purple Heart Battalion.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm saying that so that maybe you'll take it upon yourselves to look into everything that you hear and read, because there's almost always more to the story.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Awesome. Well,
Pretty good on time? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for joining.